Hey, this is Brad Block, host of The Physician's Guide to Doctoring. This is a personal and professional development podcast for physicians where we have experts on the show that try to teach us everything we should have been learning while we were memorizing Krebs cycle. Welcome back to the podcast. On today's episode, we have Zed Williamson. He is the founder of TrackableMed and the Physician Growth Accelerator, and the latter is what we're going to be talking most about today. And they help specialty private practices accelerate profitable growth. So that means leading a more sustainable existence. He's also the host of 2 podcasts, including the Physician Growth Accelerator podcast, where medical practice leaders can hear actionable insights. I love it. Actionable insights, strategies, and expert advice to optimize their medical practice. And for more than a decade, Zed and his team have helped hundreds of medical practices achieve their business goals. So, Zed Williamson, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
I really appreciate it. I'm excited to be here.
So tell us about the origins of the Physician Growth Accelerator.
Absolutely. It really comes out of witnessing failure. So if you imagine when I started TrackableMed back in 2011, the idea was we could put in ideal patient throughput to a practice by getting the patients that are best for the practice. Physicians love treating, best outcomes, and business health. And here's what happened is we would get 10 different results in 10 different cities, not from the outcome of patients wanting to be treated, but what happened within the practice. And one of the first constraints we came across was simply phones, who I refer to as Agnes who hates her life, that's answering a lot of practice phones and just making patients miserable. She was making it hard for people to book appointments. So we started a call center. We help people book appointments. But we still just realized that
How does Agnes that hates her life not end up then working in that call center? Like, what's the difference between the two?
Boy, that's,
all right, we're taking a segue already.
Yeah, we're taking a segue. That's fine. Because there is someone for every role. And a business can be a place where people can be excited to show up to and contribute and be part of creating something bigger. And so our call center, we have no Agneses. I guess I'll never be able to hire someone named that now, but it's because they show up Monday morning excited because they know what they're here for. They're excited to achieve it. We train, we hold people accountable. It's a really good place to work. So that's how they are not here.
So Agnes was working at the front desk and answering the phone was one of her many roles.
Yeah.
And it can be overwhelming.
It can be absolutely overwhelming.
Talking to you, trying to check in for their appointment. Meanwhile, the phone is ringing. Meanwhile, there's a complaint in the back about something going on. So you've got too many inputs going on at the same time. And it's like being a parent where all of your children are talking to you at the same time and you're trying to have a conversation with your spouse, right? So I understand why Agnes is miserable. So what we're doing is we're taking someone, and it's not because she's miserable, it's because the situation is. And so we're trying to make it more streamlined so that they have a more fulfilling role. And by doing that, you have a call center. And I think you're making an allusion to the fact that her name isn't Agnes because these call centers are often overseas.
Absolutely. Okay. When you think about what we were witnessing is we're working with practices all over the country. And let's say we put 10 ideal patients in 10 different practices. There would be 10 different outcomes. And we realized that there is further constraints within the practice from a business standpoint, which makes sense because the business owner, a lot of times, is seeing patients every single day. So they're not there being able to sit and think strategically about structuring their business to be the most efficient business ever. And this may sting, but I believe that in private practice, mediocrity pays good enough to not change anything. Yeah. And there can be...
If it ain't broke, don't fix it is a mantra that, to me, makes little sense because it really butts against there's always room for improvement. So those two contradict each other. Yeah.
Yes, 100%. And that's where the Physician Growth Accelerator came from is we said, if we're going to really hold our heads high and say we're helping private practices grow, we can't just toss patients into a practice and hope they get it right. We have to be able to identify and diagnose every point of constraint that happens within that practice and then give them the tools to either exploit those constraints or increase the capacity.
Okay. So there's 2 different things you've spoken about that I want to dive into further. And one is ideal patient and the second is constraint. So first, actually, I want to talk about constraint. Mm-hmm. So you're talking about kind of like a bottleneck where like patients often, like Monday morning is a bottleneck because all the problems from over the weekend have accumulated and now everyone's calling at the same time. and the wait time might be 15, 20 minutes before someone picks up the phone. And meanwhile, you're losing patients because they're out of patients. And so they hang up the phone, and now those are no longer appointments that you're getting. So like when you say constraint, that's what I'm thinking. Am I correct in that?
That's one of them. There's many constraints. So if you think about a constraint, all a constraint is a limiting factor within some part of the process. Now, that limiting factor, the biggest issue that we don't think about in business is it's usually not that it is hitting its red line, it's that we're not maximizing it all the time. So let me just back
Okay.
that up for a second. First of all, it helps to start with this belief that every system is perfectly designed to get the result it gets. That gives you freedom because now you're owning the outcome. Okay, I don't like the outcome. We just got to tweak the system. Great. So now let's look at it. Let's say you have a CT scanner and your CT scanner is, however your practice is set up, you're able to scan, I'm just going to make it up, 15 patients a day. If that's a limiting factor, let's say that is a constraint, then every day your practice should be built that there is never a day you do less than 15 scans. That's called exploiting a constraint. Because what you end up doing is the days that you only do 8, you're completely wasted because you took your biggest constraint and you didn't exploit it. And that's where you see these things stack up because there is nothing in a vacuum. So there's no, one thing that you fix. All these things are related.
Yeah.
And if you don't identify these constraints and decide which ones do we exploit, which ones do we maximize, which ones do we increase capacity, you make a lot of bad business decisions. It could be, you know what, I need to hire a PA. Okay, that might be true, but what are you building that on? It could be you added the PA and now you just have someone with an empty schedule because you
Yeah.
still have a constraint of a CT scanner. So these are the things that we look at.
Yeah. Okay. So like the rate limiting step, there's always a rate limiting step. Okay. Got it. And the other thing you mentioned was the ideal patient. So I'm thinking like you've got a spine surgeon who loves doing like cervical fusions, but not lumbar fusions. So they really want to see more cervical fusions because they just, they feel like they get better outcomes out of that. That's where you want to find your patient. I mean, for me, I see such a variety. I'm like, anyway, I think of things in terms of me and I see tons
Mhm.
of, I'm a generalist. I see tons of everything. I can see where some people would have an ideal patient and other people wouldn't. So for those that don't, is it that we don't, or is it that we're just not thinking about it the way we could?
I would say you're not thinking about it the way you could. When,
Okay.
when I define ideal, it checks off a bunch of boxes, like I mentioned earlier. It's a patient you love seeing. When they show up and you see the symptoms and their life, this is like a slam dunk. You're going to
Yeah.
change this person's life, make them super happy, and they're walking out going, I can't believe I didn't do this sooner. Second is it brings business health to the practice. You get reimbursed for this time spent, and the time spent compared to the reimbursement works. When we check all those boxes and we're purposeful about driving more of those ideal patients, that doesn't mean you tell all the other patients to go away, but it's being purposeful about understanding what part of my practice am I going to truly put ideal patients in front of me, because you can be in control. I hear people talk about burnout, and burnout can be created from a lot of different things, but one thing that feels frustrating to physicians we talk to is they show up and they just deal what showed up today, and it may not be things they enjoy. And it feels like they're moving their oar, but it's not touching the water. And that can be really frustrating. And if you focus on an ideal patient, that feeling goes away.
It does make me a little wary though,
Cool.
because there are, like, to use my own specialty, ENT, there are these balloon mills where they identify patients with sinus headaches and they really target their marketing towards them. And there are people even in my area where the patients come in with complaints that are unrelated and they somehow bring everything back to the balloon. Now, 95% of people that have sinus headaches, they're migraines, and they're not going to benefit from having someone dilate their sinus with a balloon, but they kind of make the patient believe that that's because that's what they come in saying. It's my sinuses. And you're like, it is your sinuses. And then I'm going to do this procedure on you that happens to reimburse really well. So I don't know. In my mind, that also raises a bit of a red flag. So how do you make sure you're not on this? Because it can be a slippery slope, right? Like you start off with the best of intentions, like, oh, these patients do really well, I want to do more of this. And then you end up like down that slope. So, I mean, how do you know?
Sure.
But it's hard to see it from the outside when it's happening to you.
I mean, one of these, this is bigger than a single thing, right?
Yeah.
just like I said earlier, there's no such thing as any of this existing in a vacuum. If you are not starting with an absolute focus on the best clinical treatment of patients, then this is not going to be a good fit. Like that has to be number one. What our approach or our thought is, or theory, is we don't have to sit back and just see what shows up today. If we know, like if you go back to that spine surgeon, if that spine surgeon is frustrated because in that surgeon's market, no one does disc replacement and they only do fusions. And there's patients out there going to surgeons and the surgeon is saying, here's your only option, when in reality, maybe they're a good candidate for a disc replacement. If I had an injury and I was a candidate, I'd probably rather a cervical disc replacement than a fusion. But there are patients who never get that option.
Yeah.
And so that would be a good sign of an ideal patient is, are you driving better potential care for patients that are in need that fit these check boxes that just really make you passionate about the work you do? But if you're not starting with clinical as number one, I mean, your practice is not, you're toast, really.
Yeah. We've talked about this on other shows where it's actually the physicians are solving for a problem, right? And the problem is we don't recognize how important it is to increase our visibility so that we can connect with those people, whether it's, someone like you who can help private practices stay private practice, or someone like me who has an ideal patient, where you're talking about increasing visibility to those that you can really help. We're not trying to sell, we're not ultimately salespeople.
Right.
But yet we are, because we have something that we can provide. And so how do we help kind of get over that we kind of need to be salespeople because we have a problem that we can help to solve for people?
It's a great question. I have a question. I'm curious what your answer is to this. After you treat a patient, what's one of the most common things you hear from them? Does anything jump out at you?
What do I do next? Or where do I schedule surgery?
Well, so, one of the things we hear the most is that patients say, I wish I had come in sooner.
Yes.
So if you are hearing that, guess what? They should have come in sooner.
Yes, you're doing something wrong. Yeah.
And you can
I think
own
for me,
that.
outreach to pediatricians would be something in particular, because as you were going through, my ideal patient is the kid who needs tubes, tonsils, and adenoids and has undiagnosed asthma. And so we end up completely changing that kid's life. They are, financial aspect is a little different because, that with the populations that I treat, they often have Medicaid. And so they're not reimbursing great, right? It's not going to help my bottom line to thrive. But at least for me, I find that a really fulfilling visit, because those kids, you're totally changing their life, right? And so I guess for me, that would be reaching out to the pediatricians, because they're the ones who refer. And so the sooner they can refer, the better. So I have to educate them onto when to send them to me.
And they have bias. That's the whole basis of our company, is rooted in neuroscience and understanding of human behavior. All these systems have humans attached to them. And our brain, unfortunately, it was really good 100,000 years ago because it kept us alive.
Yeah.
But right now, it's better at keeping us alive today, not very good at thinking about tomorrow and beyond.
Yeah.
And so that patient out there, let's say they're sick, they don't feel well, they're under stress, they have physical pain, their brain is working on auto mode. And it's these biases that come in that drive their behavior, keep them from seeking the treatment that, like you said, would change their life. The parents don't know to bring them to you. And then the pediatrician is also biased because they don't know what you're potentially going to do for that patient.
They don't want to send too many. They don't want to send too
Correct.
few. They want to send the right amount. And so the more you can educate them as to this is the ideal patient, this is when you send them, and this is the treatment you can start on them before they see me. So we don't need to waste visits with them. And I'm try Flonase, right? So then they've done that already. They've checked all their boxes. So by the time they see me, okay, it hasn't worked. Okay, now we're just scheduling surgery.
Yep. And I'm a big fan of action. I love talking theory, but I like people to walk away with something. So here's something everyone could write down and start doing tomorrow that will impact exactly what you're talking about. Buy a bunch of thank you cards, and don't assume you already know what I'm going to say, and have blank thank you cards in your practice. And when your patient has been treated and your family is happy, bring the blank card to them and say, Margaret, would you mind writing a thank you card to your pediatrician for recommending you come here? I'll take care of mailing it. I mean, I just saw it on your face, like how
Yeah,
you can get
that's
chills
good.
because now the mom is thanking her pediatrician for sending her to you, which creates massive trust.
Yeah,
And it's not the doctor, everyone knows you should thank. Yeah, yeah, okay, write a card, whatever. But
yeah,
now it's coming from the patient. I mean, it's really
yeah.
powerful.
And it's less work for me. I don't have to sit
Correct.
there and ask ChatGPT what I should write in the thing.
Yes,
May have
exactly.
done that recently for a Mother's Day card. No, that's brilliant because then they're not hearing it for you where it seems self-serving. They're
Correct.
hearing it from the patient. Just have to make sure the return address is from the patient, not from your
Correct.
office.
Yeah, you ask them, put the return address, you have
Yeah,
them,
yeah.
do everything.
You
You're
put the
putting the
stamp
stamp
on
on
it.
it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a great idea. That's a really great idea. Because we do have those patients every so often that are so effusive about what they've experienced and they're looking for some way to give back, right? You've given so much to them and they want a way to give back. And this is an easy way. And then they feel better about the situation too, because they've done something. So that's a really great idea. Okay. We've been talking like we kind of got off track, but it's a great conversation. What the original intent was, because I wanted to really get into the nuts and bolts of when you look at a practice, right? When you are brought in, listen, Zed, we need help. What are you going to look at? Like, where do you even begin? And what is your process for analyzing a practice?
Yeah. So we look at 9 points of constraint within the practice that range from the very beginning of a patient not even knowing they have a problem, all the way through being able to do something that you actually bill insurance for. And those 9 points of constraint, I'm not going to list them all, they're on our website. But what we do is we have metrics across all of them so that we can look and say, where do we have constraint? We're going to have constraint everywhere. So where are the first places we need to take action? And we'll create a report that has about 30 metrics on it that shows here's normal, here's where you are. So you're either high or you're low. Here's the revenue impact to your practice so that you can look at it and say, okay, when we fix this, the outcome will be this. And so we're taking information from the practice to do this diagnostic. But you asked, where do we look first? We first want to understand basically what does the ideal patient look like for the practice? And for instance, yours, what you mentioned, that is an ideal patient. Like I could see on your face the passion you have about helping that kid. So in that case, you'd be structuring the practice to be able to handle as many of those families as possible, keeping in mind that maybe reimbursement isn't that great. So we just have to account for that. And so the business needs to be healthy enough for you to treat the patients that you love treating. And so we look at that first. And then we look at things like, what is a patient's perspective of your practice? What is it like getting in touch with your practice? We did a 7,000 call study across 22 practices, and 42% of all calls to practices go unanswered. So is that a simple thing? I mean, just think about that. Just telling 4 out of 10 people, sorry, we can't talk to you today.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's
You're-
because part of the reason is our businesses work different than other businesses. And part of that is because we're a guild. Like physicians are a guild. We decide how many physicians there are in America. And because we can control that, we control supply and demand. And so there's always going to be demand. Right. If you're in some super saturated place, like you're a plastic surgeon in Beverly Hills, fine. There's one of you on every block. For most of the time, there's a demand out there. So we are a little different. And that's why we can actually sustain a business while having 42% of our calls unanswered. I mean, it's ridiculous. But if you think about it, like we're here to help the patients. And if 42% of the time, the wait is so long that they give up and hang up, we're not helping them. We're not helping them. So that's something that we still need to solve for, even if our schedules are full.
Yeah. And, so from there, we look at, what is our conversion rate to book an appointment? What is the show rate? What is the conversion rate to the treatment, the diagnostic? What is the patient perspective on the practice? I mean, we do a lot of patient interviews to uncover bias. So what we like to do is dig into what are the things that are just making the patient do automatic behaviors. And we talked to a patient recently, and this is exactly how the sentence came out. She said, I was so happy with the treatment. They absolutely knocked it out of the park. It was above the moon. I couldn't expect any more. I will never recommend another patient go. And it flowed just like that. It kind of caught us off guard, right? And we went, I'm sorry. She said, oh, the experience was horrible. The front desk was horrible. Dealing with the people on the phone, everything was miserable. but the outcome was great, but I'll never
Yeah.
recommend anyone.
It was the 10th doctor I saw, and now I'm cured. 3 stars. What? Yeah.
But the thing is that experience really matters because here's one of the biggest constraints we uncover is culture. And so that might sound strange, but the business culture within a practice has a massive impact on the potential success that a practice can achieve. Meaning, is there drama? Is there gossip? Is the staff showing up rowing in the same direction, or are they bickering at each other? People, not showing up to work? Is it hard to hire? Is it hard to retain staff? So that's one of the things that we dig into, because I don't care how ideal your patient is or how great your systems are or what fancy software you use. If your staff is miserable and the culture is bad, you have a limiting factor that you will never outgrow.
Well, I think the average turnover in our field for front desk staff is like 18 months. So you can either accept that that's our turnover because that's the standard in the field. Or you can ask, how can we do better? How can we retain our staff? Because it's expensive. Every time you've got to train someone new, it's expensive. You're losing time, you're losing patients. Those calls aren't being answered. Those appointments aren't being made because you're training a new staff member. So the longer you can hold on to it is expensive to lose staff, and it is valuable to hold on to them for all the reasons that you said, because then you're improving the culture. They're staying because they want to stay, because they could make another $1 an hour across the street, but if they're enjoying what they do. So how do we influence the culture? Because I'm back there seeing patients. I'm not up there checking them in and at the front desk. So how do I influence culture?
So we go through an entire process. If we uncover that culture is a major issue, we will do a full process to help someone fix their culture. It's going to be tied to identifying the true North Star for the practice, like what actually matters to you as the business owner. And then what are the standards that this practice has to be kept to? But many times bad culture is not because people are bad. It's because there's no guardrails, there's no standards. And it's just, well, what I do doesn't matter. So I'm just going to, if I show up, they don't say anything. If I don't show up, they don't say anything. I only get bickered at if I do this wrong. They never tell me if I do anything right. There's some
I'll
simple
do the
things.
minimum to not get fired. I won't try
Correct.
to excel, but I'll just do the minimum not to get fired. Yeah.
Right. And unfortunately, when we build companies, a lot of the stuff that we're doing, I learned from first-hand knowledge. Culture was quote unquote important to me because I've worked at places with horrible cultures. And then my culture wasn't good. And I couldn't believe it because I thought, I'm a nice guy, try to keep a fun place. That's not where you get strong culture from. You get strong culture from belief and from standards, behavioral values. What must it be? What must your behavior be like for you to fit in this practice? When you state those things and then you give people easy tools for them to understand where they stand, that's where you get this amazing culture and people are ready to run through brick walls.
What about autonomy? Because I've read that autonomy is a valuable part of culture building, because the more autonomy and trust, the more fulfilling it is for them and the less there is on your plate to do and worry about.
Yeah. So autonomy comes from trust. So if we break
Okay.
this down, so we think about, none of this stuff is in a vacuum. So what I love is the definition of lack of trust. What is important to me is not safe with you. So if I don't trust you, what is important to me is not safe with you. So if I don't give you autonomy, unfortunately, the way our brain is, that means I assume you don't trust me, which means I assume you don't think what is important to you is safe with me. And so now it creates this bad outcome. I would say autonomy is not the tactic. Autonomy is the outcome. The symptom is trust, and then the autonomy is the outcome. If you just start giving autonomy, then you can also create bad culture because now it feels like you don't care about what happens.
Yeah, good point. So there's something that we have to talk about before we end the interview, and that's no-show rate. Because, in my practice, we're a huge practice. We've got great leadership. We've got tons of systems in place, and it still happens. It still happens frequently. So if it's happening to us, it's happening to everybody. How do we address no-show rate?
Yeah. So it's one of the things that we dig into in a diagnostic to understand what is creating it. So I'm going to give one tip. This tip will work if the cause is also this thing. So the challenge about show rates is it's related to a lot of different aspects. But generally what you want to think about is a patient is not really excited to see you. They feel like they have to see you, and they probably got to a point where either someone told them or I should do this. It's a lot of shoulds. It's a lot of like, so
They're
they're already
uncomfortable enough to see you, but they're
right.
not excited to see you. Yeah.
They're not excited.
This is not a birthday party. Yeah.
Correct. Right. So you have to understand that they're starting with that truth. Okay. As they're going through the process, their brain is going to be looking for ways to get out of that discomfort. So let's say you have a really complicated EMR and you ask a patient to log into their portal and fill out a bunch of information before they show up. If you do that, you're going to create a higher no-show rate. And I'll explain how this happens.
Yes, but if they show up on time for their appointment and they haven't filled out their paperwork, now they're late, and now the rest of my day is screwed.
I love it.
Because
Yeah,
they
let's
showed
talk
up
about
on time
both
for their
sides.
appointment, so I have to see them, but now they're late, and so everyone I have to see after them is late, and they're pissed at me because I don't respect their time.
Right.
So there's a, how do we solve for that?
Nothing's in a vacuum. So
Yeah.
so it's a great scenario. I'm so glad you said that. So, let's say your staff is talking to a patient and they just give them that. So the patient doesn't do it. And now it's coming up to your appointment. Oh, I didn't do the EMR thing. That means they're probably not expecting me anyway. That's what their automatic brain is doing. Takes them off the hook. The person who just shows up that didn't fill it out, this is also because of how we communicated to the patient. So as an example, listen, I'm just going to kind of go off the top of my head how this could sound a little bit different. Margaret, we have a portal. We'd love for you to log in, fill out the information. It makes check-in so much easier. Does that stress you out in any way? Do you have any, is there any feeling like you wouldn't be able to do that? Okay, so there's no reason we shouldn't expect that to be complete. Great. Okay, no matter what, even if you don't fill it out, we're going to see you Tuesday at 8 a.m., okay? And so now what you've done is you've covered both sides. Now,
Just show up a little earlier so there's time to fill out that paperwork.
and so then you could also structure that. But here's the thing that I would actually dig into is what is the business impact? Because you are going to have this emotional connection to the people starting late, and now everyone else is late. And so you might have a bias against how often that is happening. And so you might think this happens all the time, but if you look at the data, it happened 9 times in 60 days. Okay,
Yeah.
well, so now let's make a business decision about a fact. We have to get to facts. Truths are bad things for us to make business decisions on. Okay, truth is about perspective. Fact is real.
But 9 times out of 60, I'm running behind. Still not good. Still not,
Yeah, so then
and
that-
some people
that
don't
would-
mind that. Some
correct.
physicians don't mind that. It just happens for me. I just have this narrative in my head of what the people in the waiting room are thinking. Now, ultimately, what happens most of the time is they get into the room and they're like, oh, no, it's totally fine. No, I totally understand. Yeah, it happens all the time because the bar is so low for
Yeah,
a physician. They just expect to, they expect to, so that expectation kind of saves us. Nonetheless, we've got these two. But what you're saying is you just have to engineer the situation better. Like
You have to engineer the system.
find out why they're not showing up and then solve for that. But
Yeah.
the answer they give you might not be the real answer because they might tell you, if you reach out to them like, hey, how come you didn't show up for their appointment? They're not gonna be like, well, I kind of felt like you didn't, they're not going to think that. They're going to say like, oh, I forgot about it. They're just going to give you an answer.
You need to do some diagnostic on your side with some assumption. There's one bit of scripting that we use on the phone that helps kind of mop up a lot of no-shows. And it's going to sound strange at first, but it's the end of the call. And you go, okay, Margaret, I've got a little bit of a weird question. Do you expect any surprises to pop up that would make you miss this appointment? And here's what we're doing. We're actually using bias in our favor. So the bias we're using is called commitment bias. And it's when I state something, it actually drives my future behavior. It's a weird question because do you expect a surprise? Well, that's a little
It's a contradiction. You can't expect
contradiction.
a surprise. Otherwise, by definition, it would not be a surprise.
Correct.
Yes.
But what happens is Margaret goes, no, I don't expect anything. Great. And then what happens is when Margaret's, buddy Brenda says, hey, do you want to go get margaritas at lunch? Margaret goes, this is a surprise. I told him I'd be there. And it drives human behavior. So that's one simple thing that can kind of work across the board. But what we like to do is look at what is the process? What's the minimal effective dose for the patient to fill out paperwork that helps the practice, but also doesn't overwhelm the patient?
Yeah.
And how are we communicating to the patient on the expectations? And, it could be something as simple as like, Margaret, have you ever been to a practice and your appointment's for 10 and you don't go back until 10:20? Oh yeah, that's frustrating, right? Yeah. It's, we think that too, which is why we run a different schedule. And so if you don't have the paperwork filled out before you show up, you need to show up at 9:45. Otherwise, it would be you that makes all those people late. That's going to change your behavior.
Yeah, change the expectation. And you know what? I think the person that was trying to pull Margaret away from her appointment to go get margaritas, that was angry Agnes. It was her all
Yeah.
along trying to chip away at your practice.
Every
Yeah.
chance she gets.
Well, Zed Williamson of Physician Growth Accelerator, thank you so much for all this great information and for what you do to help private practices thrive and stay in business and keep doing better. So if people want to find you online or find the Physician Growth Accelerator, where do we find you?
Yeah, the number one thing to do is go to physiciangrowthaccelerator.com. You can check your vitals. That's how we refer to your constraints. It's an easy online click, 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 and it tells you where to look, what questions to ask, and how to dig deeper. So physiciangrowthaccelerator.com.
Thanks for listening. So please share it or like it or comment on a social media post or write us a 5-star review. Thank us again for listening to The Physician's Guide to Doctoring.